In a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Atlanta, Officer Brian Hayes patrolled the streets, a well-known figure in the area. He was a man of rigid views, raised in a town where diversity was scarce, and he developed a hardened stance against those he deemed out of place. For years, he had adhered to the belief that the law was clear-cut, and that the people who broke it often fit a certain profile, usually black men, who he believed were more likely to cause trouble one evening. While on a routine patrol, Officer Hayes saw a man walking alone on the sidewalk. The man was black, well-dressed in a button-up shirt and slacks, with a backpack slung over his shoulder. It was around 9 p.m., and the streets were relatively empty, but Officer Hayes couldn't help but feel suspicious. Something about the man just didn't sit right with him. His gut told him to investigate. Without thinking much, Hayes decided to pull over and approach the man. Named Malik Turner, continued walking as the patrol car slowed to a stop beside him. He was aware of the officer's gaze, but he didn't alter his stride. He had learned to remain composed when facing situations like this. After all, he was used to being stopped by police. It had become a part of his life ever since he'd moved to the area. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but he knew how things could escalate. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Hayes called out as he stepped out of his car. "I need to talk to you for a moment." Malik turned to face the officer, his expression neutral but guarded. "Sure, officer. What's this about you're walking in a part of town where I don't usually see people like you?" Hayes said, his tone laced with condescension. "Let me see some ID. You got anything on you?" Malik didn't flinch. He knew the routine. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out his wallet and handed the officer his driver's license. Hayes glanced at the ID, but before he could speak, he did a double take. The name on the ID read Malik Turner, and the picture showed a man with a calm, confident expression. But it wasn't the name or the picture that caught Hayes off guard. It was the occupation listed under profession. Dr. Hayes muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. "You're a doctor, Malik." Sensing the shift in the officer's attitude, nodded calmly. "Yes, I'm a pediatrician at Grady Hospital. I'm just heading home from work for a moment." Officer Hayes just stared at the ID, his mind racing. He had expected to find a typical profile, a man with a criminal record or a history that matched the prejudice he'd held for years. But instead, he was looking at the ID of a highly educated, well-respected professional, someone who had dedicated his life to helping others. It didn't match the narrative that Hayes had constructed in his head, still stunned. Hayes handed the ID back to Malik, his hand shaking slightly. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," he muttered, clearly unsettled by the revelation. "I didn't know." Malik took the ID back, not acknowledging the apology. "It's fine, officer. I understand. But you should know, I've had to stop and explain myself like this more times than I care to admit. People like you." He paused, locking eyes with Hayes. "People like you don't always see us for who we really are." There was a long silence, the weight of Malik's words hanging in the air. Officer Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. He was a man who prided himself on following the rules, on making quick judgments that fit within his narrow worldview. But now, in this moment, his assumptions were being challenged. Malik stood there for a few seconds longer, watching Hayes, waiting for the officer to speak. Finally, Hayes cleared his throat. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? I shouldn't have assumed anything about you," Hayes said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He was struggling with his own internal conflict. The man in front of him didn't fit his usual expectations. And that realization rattled him more than he cared to admit. Malik nodded slowly, his face still calm. "It's not about being sorry, officer. It's about understanding. Understanding that people like me don't always fit the stereotype you've been taught." We're not just statistics or criminal profiles. We're people. And we deserve to be seen as such. The officer stood silent, his eyes cast downward as he processed Malik's words. It was a moment of reckoning for him, an uncomfortable but necessary realization that his worldview had been shaped by prejudice and assumptions. For the first time, he was seeing a man not through the lens of his biases, but as a human being, someone with a life, a profession, and a purpose far beyond what he had initially assumed. Malik turned to walk away. But before he did, he paused. "Take care of yourself, officer," Malik said without turning around. "And maybe, just maybe, take a moment to rethink who you think belongs in your town. I'm sure there are more people like me than you realize." As Malik continued down the street, Officer Hayes stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had just been. The interaction had been brief, but its impact would last far longer. It had shattered the walls Hayes had built around himself, walls that were now crumbling in the face of a simple truth. People were not what they appeared to be at first glance. From that night on, Officer Hayes became a man who was more mindful of his judgments, more thoughtful in his approach, and more willing to acknowledge the humanity in everyone he encountered, no matter the color of their skin. And as for Malik, he continued to do his work, knowing that he had, once again, shown someone the power of breaking stereotypes.